They blocked me from the reading of my father-in-law's will, claiming I wasn't real family after 15 years of marriage. Little did they know, he'd secretly left me his entire $40 million estate and the family business they expected to inherit. The shock on their entitled faces when they discovered I was now their boss made every years of their condescension absolutely worth it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany doors to Preston Whitmore's law office remained firmly closed to me as my husband's family gathered inside for the reading of my father-in-law's will. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes of Daniel, his sister, Victoria, and his brother Christopher, all seated in a neat semicircle facing Preston's desk. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm sorry," the receptionist said, her voice tinged with embarrassment. "Mr. Christopher was very clear that only blood relatives and their spouses are permitted for the reading." I nodded, clutching my simple black purse, the one Victoria had once mockingly called refreshingly economical at a family dinner. Of course, I understand. What they didn't understand was why I had been summoned to the building at all. They assumed it was a clerical error, the kind of mistake that someone like me, the daughter of a middle school teacher who had married into the illustrious Whitmore family, would naturally encounter. 2 weeks earlier, at Gerald Whitmore's funeral, Christopher had made their position painfully clear. "Dad never really considered you family, Elena," he'd said, swirling expensive scotch in a crystal tumbler. "You were just the woman who couldn't give Daniel children. Bloodlines mattered to Dad." Victoria had nodded in agreement. "He changed his will 6 months ago, you know. Said he needed to protect the family legacy." The emphasis on family had been deliberate, a reminder of my perpetual outsider status despite 15 years of marriage. What none of them knew was that Gerald had called me to his hospital room 3 days before he died. Alone, without Daniel or any of his children present. What they didn't know was what the great Gerald Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Development Corporation, had whispered to me with his final strength. And they certainly didn't know about the private meetings I'd had with Preston Whitmore, Gerald's younger brother and the family's attorney, over the past 5 months. I settled into a chair in the waiting area, checking my watch. Preston had been very specific about the timing. "The reading will begin at 10 a.m., he had instructed during our last private meeting. "You will arrive at 10 a.m. but remain in the waiting room. At precisely 10:45 a.m., I will call you in." Through the frosted glass, I could see Christopher, gesturing emphatically, probably already discussing how he would restructure the company once he assumed control. Victoria would be calculating her share. And Daniel, my husband of 15 years, would be sitting quietly, expecting his portion but never fighting for more. Not from his father in life, and not from his estate in death. I checked my watch again. 10:42 a.m. For 15 years, I had worked alongside Gerald, transforming his regional construction company into a national development corporation, while Daniel managed a small satellite office, a position gifted to him by his father. I had worked my way up from project coordinator to become Gerald's most trusted advisor, though never with an official title or proper recognition. "You understand? Buildings and numbers in a way my children never could," Gerald had told me once, reviewing quarterly projections in his office while his children attended a charity gala in his name. "But they need to believe they're entitled to this company. It's better this way." And so I had worked in the shadows, implementing strategies that doubled the company's value, identifying properties that would yield maximum returns, and quietly guiding Gerald's decisions while his children took credit for the company's success. I remembered the day Victoria had mocked my suggestion about expanding into sustainable development at a family dinner. "Elena, darling, stick to planning the charity luncheons," she'd said with a condescending smile. "Leave the real business to people who understand it." 2 months later, Gerald had announced the company's revolutionary pivot toward green building, Victoria's brilliant idea, according to the press release. The initiative I'd researched and developed for 6 months had been presented as her brainchild, while I sat silently at the end of the table during the board meeting. Sometimes the real power is in being underestimated, Gerald had told me privately afterward. Remember that, Elena. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Chris says you should just go home. Reading will take hours. Meet for dinner? I didn't reply. Instead, I watched the second hand tick toward 10:45 a.m. Right on schedule, Preston emerged from his office, his face impressively neutral as he approached me. Mrs. Reynolds, he announced formally, loud enough for the receptionist and anyone listening from his office to hear. Would you please join us? There's a matter concerning you in the will after all. I stood, smoothing the jacket of my simple black suit, another target of Victoria's past condescension. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. As I followed Preston toward the mahogany doors, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a decorative mirror. For a moment, I hardly recognized myself. The meek, accommodating Elena, who had weathered 15 years of subtle degradation, had been replaced by someone with purpose, with knowledge, with power. The woman in the reflection knew exactly what Preston was about to read from Gerald Whitmore's will, and exactly how the lives of everyone in that room were about to change forever. I stepped through the doorway, all eyes turning to me with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance to outright hostility. Only Preston knew what was coming next. "Ah, Elena," Christopher called out with mock concern. "There's been a misunderstanding. We're discussing family matters. Perhaps you could wait for Daniel at that little cafe down the street." I took the, empty seat Preston had deliberately placed at the center of the room, directly across from his desk. "Actually," Preston said, adjusting his glasses as he picked up the document before him, "we've just reached the most significant portion of Gerald's will, and Elena's presence is not just permitted, it's essential." Essential? Christopher scoffed, his voice carrying that familiar condescending tone. "Preston, there must be some mistake." "There is no mistake," Preston replied calmly. "If you'll allow me to continue." I settled into my chair, feeling the weight of 3 pairs of hostile eyes. Victoria's perfectly manicured nails drummed impatiently on the armrest. Christopher's jaw clenched so tightly I could almost hear his expensive dental work grinding. Only Daniel looked merely confused, his gaze darting between me and his siblings. "Before I address the specific distributions," Preston continued, "Gerald included a personal statement to be read in the presence of all parties." He cleared his throat and began reading from a separate document. "To my family gathered here today, if you're listening to this, then I've finally lost the battle I've been fighting for years. But before Preston details who gets what, I want to tell you a story, a true story about Whitmore Development Corporation that none of you know." The room fell silent. I kept my expression neutral, though I knew exactly what was coming. I'd helped Gerald draft this letter during those final weeks in the hospital, his voice growing weaker while his resolve strengthened. 15 years ago, Preston read, this company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The Westfield project had failed. Spectacularly, 3 of our major developments were tied up in litigation, and our reputation was in shambles. The banks were calling in loans I couldn't repay. None of you knew this because I kept it from you. I was a proud man, too proud to admit I was about to lose everything our family had built over 3 generations. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Christopher's expression darkened. This was clearly news to them. What saved Whitmore Development wasn't luck or my business acumen. It was the woman Christopher and Victoria have spent 15 years belittling at every opportunity, Elena Reynolds. All eyes turned to me. I kept my gaze on Preston, my hands folded calmly in my lap. When Daniel brought home his new girlfriend from the urban planning department at State University, I saw an opportunity. Elena's thesis on sustainable urban development wasn't just innovative, It was exactly what could save the Westfield project. While you all dismissed her as just Daniel's latest, I recognized something in her that reminded me of myself 50 years ago: raw talent, uncompromising work ethic, and a vision for what this industry could become. Preston paused, allowing the words to sink in. Daniel was staring at me now, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. The Westfield pivot that industry magazines credited me for. That was Elena's strategy, implemented exactly as she designed it. The riverfront district that won us the Urban Development Award. Elena's concept from start to finish. The sustainable building standards that have become our corporate signature? All Elena. Christopher started to interrupt, but Preston held up his hand. Your father requested no interruptions during this portion. He continued reading. For 15 years, Elena has worked alongside me, often putting in longer hours than I did, rebuilding and expanding this company while receiving neither credit nor appropriate compensation. She has attended every planning, meeting, reviewed every contract, and solved every crisis, all while being treated like an interloper by my own children. I thought back to all those late nights in Gerald's office, the two of us poring over blueprints and financial projections, while the rest of the family attended galas and charity events. I remembered the first time Victoria had dismissed one of my suggestions at a family dinner, and how Gerald had caught my eye across the table with the slightest nod, his signal that we would discuss it privately later. That suggestion had saved the company $3.2 million the following quarter. Why did I allow this arrangement to continue? Preston read. Partly out of misguided pride. I couldn't admit to my children that their father was no longer the business genius they believed him to be, and partly because Elena herself suggested it. This produced audible gasps from both Victoria and Christopher. Daniel simply looked stunned. Elena understood something about family dynamics that I was too stubborn to see. That Christopher and Victoria would never accept guidance or leadership from someone they considered beneath them. So we created a system where they could believe they were involved in running the company while the real decisions happened behind the scenes. Preston turned the page, his voice steady and professional despite the bombshell he was delivering. I am not proud of this deception. I failed as a father by not challenging my children's sense of entitlement. I failed as a business leader by allowing appearances to matter more than merit. The only person in this room I didn't fail is Elena, who has remained loyal to this company despite receiving nothing but contempt from the family she married into. Christopher's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Victoria sat rigidly in her chair, her expression frozen in disbelief. Daniel looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. You may be wondering why I'm telling you all this now. Preston continued reading. Because Whitmore Development Corporation deserves a leader who truly understands its operations, its challenges, and its future potential. Not someone who believes leadership is their birthright. I remembered the day Gerald had first broached this subject with me, 6 months before his cancer diagnosis. We had just successfully navigated a potentially devastating zoning crisis, a situation Victoria had created by ignoring my advice about community engagement, and were celebrating. Quietly in his office, I'm not going to live forever, Elena, he had said, swirling his scotch thoughtfully. What happens to all your work when I'm gone? I had no answer then. I assumed the company would pass to his children, as had always been the plan, and I would continue working in the background or perhaps finally strike out on my own. How much longer could you tolerate being invisible? He'd pressed. Watching Christopher dismantle your sustainability initiatives because they're too expensive? Seeing Victoria take credit for your community development programs while treating you like Daniel's inconvenient appendage? That conversation had been the beginning of a plan that had culminated in this moment, in this room, with Preston reading Gerald's final testament. Remember the night of my 70th birthday? Preston continued reading. When Christopher stood up and gave that speech about the Whitmore legacy and blood being thicker than water, Elena was working in my home office that night, finalizing the Johnson acquisition that saved us from the recession while all of you celebrated. That night, I made my decision about the future of this company. Preston paused, looking up from the document. The following section addresses the specific terms of the will. Would you like me to continue, or do you need a moment? Christopher slammed his hand on the armrest. This is preposterous. Dad would never— I assure you, Preston interrupted firmly, these are Gerald's exact words, written and notarized in my presence, and I should add that he was of completely sound mind. How convenient that none of us heard any of this while— He was alive, Victoria snapped, her cold eyes fixed on me. Elena obviously manipulated him during his illness. I finally spoke, my voice calmer than I felt. Gerald and I worked together for 15 years, Victoria. He made this decision 6 months before his diagnosis. You expect us to believe our father secretly made his daughter-in-law his right hand for 15 years without any of us noticing? Christopher demanded. I met his gaze steadily. You never noticed because you never paid attention. How many times did you actually visit the main office last year, Christopher? 3? 4? I run the West Coast Division, he protested. You hold the title of West Coast Director, I corrected him. The division is actually managed by Robert Phillips, who reports directly to me. Or rather, reported to your father and me. Daniel finally found his voice. Elena, why didn't you ever tell me? I turned to my husband, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. I tried, Daniel, in the beginning. Remember when I would bring up ideas about the Westfield project? You told me to leave work at the office because it stressed you out. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He remembered. After a few attempts, I had stopped sharing that part of my life with him, creating the divide that had gradually grown between us over the years. If I may continue, Preston interjected, returning to the document. The final paragraph of Gerald's statement reads as follows. So now, you know the truth. Whitmore Development Corporation's success over the past 15 years is largely due to Elena Reynolds, and its future will be in her hands as well. The silence that followed Gerald's declaration was deafening. Preston set down the personal statement and picked up the legal document that constituted the actual will. Now, regarding the specific terms of inheritance, he began, his voice taking on an even more formal tone. The following distributions are legally binding and have been structured to withstand any potential challenges. He glanced briefly at me before continuing. We both knew challenges were inevitable. To my son, Daniel Whitmore, Preston read, I leave the sum of $5 million to be held in trust and distributed as an annual salary of $250,000 over 20 years. Daniel's expression was unreadable. The amount was generous by normal standards, but a pittance compared to what the family had expected him to receive. To my daughter, Victoria Whitmore Harrington, I leave the sum of $5 million under identical terms. Victoria's face flushed with anger. $5 million? The Hastings Street property alone is worth 4 times that. Preston ignored her outburst and continued. To my son, Christopher Whitmore, I leave the sum of $5 million, under identical terms. This is outrageous, Christopher exploded, rising halfway out of his chair. The company is worth at least $400 million. Where's the rest of it? If you'll allow me to finish, Preston said firmly, all will be explained. Christopher sank back into his chair, seething with barely contained rage. To each of my grandchildren, Preston continued, I leave trust funds of $2 million each to be accessible when they reach the age of 30 or complete a graduate degree, whichever comes first. That accounted for another $14 million. Victoria had 3 children, Christopher had 4. The Whitmore family home at 1857 Lakeshore Drive and all its contents, I leave to my brother Preston Whitmore, with the stipulation that it be maintained as the location for annual family gatherings for a minimum period of 20 years. Preston looked up briefly, his expression betraying a hint of surprise. This particular bequest had been added in the final revision, without my knowledge. The remaining assets of my estate, Preston continued, including but not limited to, my controlling interest in Whitmore Development Corporation representing 78% of outstanding shares, all subsidiary companies, all real estate holdings not explicitly designated elsewhere, all financial accounts, investments, and retirement funds, my personal collection of art and antiquities, and all intellectual property associated with Whitmore Enterprises. Christopher interrupted again, his voice razor-sharp. Just get to the point. Who gets the company? Preston looked at him sternly over his reading glasses. I am getting to. The point, Christopher. If you would allow me to complete the legal language necessary for a will of this complexity. He returned to the document. I hereby leave in their entirety to Eleanor Reynolds, who has served as the de facto Chief Operating Officer of Whitmore Development Corporation for the past 15 years, without recognition or appropriate compensation. Chatorchi, room erupted. Victoria let out a strangled cry that sounded more animal than human. Christopher leapt to his feet, his face contorted with rage. This is a fraud, he shouted, jabbing his finger first at Preston, then at me. She manipulated a sick old man. We'll contest this. Preston remained perfectly calm. As I said, Gerald anticipated challenges. That's why he took extraordinary measures to document his mental competence. We have video recordings of every discussion leading to these decisions, evaluated by 3 independent psychiatric experts, all confirming he was of sound mind. I don't care if he had the entire Psychiatric Association sign off, Victoria hissed. No court will uphold this travesty. Actually, Preston countered, Gerald also anticipated that specific objection. Elena, would you like to explain, or shall I? All eyes turned to me. I had remained silent throughout the reading, watching 15 years of careful work culminate in this moment. Now I straightened in my chair, meeting Victoria's hostile gaze directly. 3 years ago, I explained, your father restructured the company. The controlling interest was transferred to a privately held corporation called GW Innovations. We know that, Christopher snapped. It was a tax strategy. I nodded. Partly. But what you don't know is that Gerald made me the CEO of GW Innovations at that time. I've legally been your boss for 3 years. The shock on their faces would have been comical under different circumstances. That's impossible, Victoria whispered. We would have known. Would you? I asked. When was the last time any of you reviewed the corporate structure documents? Gerald signed everything, attended all the board meetings. As far as you were concerned, nothing had changed. Daniel, who had been unnaturally quiet, finally spoke. You've been the CEO of our parent company for 3 years and never told me? There was hurt in his voice, and for the first time since entering the room, I felt a flicker of regret. Daniel had never been cruel like his siblings, just oblivious, content to coast through life on his father's reputation. Gerald asked me not to, I said softly. He wanted to tell all of you himself when the time was right. Then he got sick and conveniently never got around to it, Christopher finished bitterly. He tried, I countered. Last Christmas, at the family gathering, he started talking about the company's future and new leadership, but you, Christopher, interrupted with that toast about Whitmore blood and how the company would always remain in the family. He decided it wasn't the right moment. Preston cleared his throat. There's a video recording of that evening as well, which Gerald specifically instructed me to preserve. Victoria's eyes narrowed dangerously. So you're telling us you're already legally in control? That this will is just… What? A formality? Not exactly, Preston answered for me. The will transfers Gerald's personal assets and officially recognizes Elena's position. More importantly, It establishes the terms under which the company will operate moving forward. He returned to the document. I further stipulate that Whitmore Development Corporation shall continue to employ my children, Daniel, Victoria, and Christopher, in positions commensurate with their abilities as determined by Elena Reynolds, provided they demonstrate appropriate professional conduct. Christopher's laugh was harsh and incredulous. You expect us to work for her? To take orders from Daniel's wife? You've already been taking her orders for 3 years, Preston pointed out. You just didn't know it. I leaned forward slightly. Every major decision you've implemented since 2022 came from me, Christopher. The Pacific Shores development you're so proud of? My design, my financing structure, my construction timeline. His face contorted with disbelief and fury. That's a lie. I developed Pacific Shores from the ground up. Check your email archives, I suggested. Every key element came in messages from your father, who was relaying my recommendations. We have those documented as well. Victoria, always quicker. Then her brother had gone very still. The corporate restructuring 3 years ago, she said slowly. The succession planning committee, the strategic planning retreats, all of that was preparing for this moment, I confirmed. Gerald knew his health was declining even before the cancer diagnosis. He wanted a smooth transition. Daniel looked stunned. Did everyone know except us? Not everyone, Preston replied. Only the board of directors, the executive leadership team, and key department heads. So basically, everyone who actually runs the company, Victoria said bitterly. Yes, I acknowledged. The people who do the daily work of making Whitmore development successful. Christopher pounded his fist on the arm of his chair. This ends now. I'll resign before I take orders from... That is your choice, Preston interrupted, though I would advise against making hasty decisions. However, I should complete the reading of the will before anyone makes career decisions. He adjusted his glasses and continued. Should any of my children contest this will or resign from Whitmore Development Corporation in protest within 1 year of my death, their personal inheritance of $5 million shall be forfeited and redistributed to the charitable foundation established in my name. The room fell silent again. Gerald had effectively checkmated his children. They could accept their diminished positions and reduced inheritances, or they could walk away. With nothing, Preston set down the document. That concludes the formal reading of the will. Are there any questions I can address? Victoria stood abruptly, gathering her designer purse. This isn't over, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Not by a long shot. Christopher followed. Suit. We'll see what the courts have to say about this arrangement. Preston sighed. As your father's attorney and yours, may I strongly advise you to review the documentation before pursuing litigation? Gerald spent 2 years preparing for this transition. Every legal contingency has been addressed. We'll get our own attorneys, Christopher snapped. Of course, Preston replied. That is your right, though I should mention that all legal expenses for such challenges must be paid from your personal funds. Per the corporate bylaws revised 3 years ago, company resources cannot be used for litigation against the CEO. Christopher and Victoria exchanged glances, suddenly less certain. Their lavish lifestyles had always been funded by generous salaries and expense accounts. Without access to company resources, a protracted legal battle would quickly deplete their personal finances. As they moved toward the door, Victoria paused and turned to Daniel. Are you coming? Daniel hadn't moved from his chair. He was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Daniel, Victoria insisted, we need to present a united front. He finally looked up at his sister. I need to talk to my wife. Your wife! Christopher spat the word. Just stole our company right out from under us, and apparently has been lying to all of us for years. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. I'll meet you later. With final glares in my direction, Victoria and Christopher stormed out, leaving me alone with Daniel and Preston. "Perhaps you two would like some privacy," Preston suggested, standing. "No," Daniel said quietly. "I'd like you to stay, Uncle Preston. I have questions, and I think I need a neutral witness." Preston nodded and resumed his seat. Daniel turned to face me directly. "Was any of it real?" he asked. Daniel's question hung in the air between us. Was any of it real? The pain in his voice cut through my carefully constructed composure. For all the scenarios I had anticipated, all the reactions I had prepared for, this simple question caught me completely off guard. "What exactly are you asking, Daniel?" I needed clarification before I could answer. "Our marriage," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Was it real? Or was it just a way for you to get close to my father's company?" Preston shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Perhaps I should—" "Please stay," I interrupted, then turned back to my husband. "Daniel, I need you to listen carefully. I did not marry you to get close to your father or his company. I had never even met Gerald when we started dating." Daniel's eyes searched mine, looking for deception. "But you've been working with him since right after we got married. Was that a coincidence?" I sighed, recalling how it had actually begun. "Do you remember our first Christmas together? The family dinner at your parents' house?" He nodded slowly. "Your father cornered me in his study. He'd looked up my academic background and read my thesis on sustainable urban development. He had questions about the Westfield project, specific, technical questions that surprised me. When I answered, he seemed impressed. The memory was still vivid. Gerald's penetrating gaze as I outlined my thoughts on how the troubled development could be salvaged, his thoughtful nods as I explained concepts that most developers at that time considered fringe theories. A week later, he invited me to tour the Westfield site. Just me, not you. He said he wanted a fresh perspective. That tour turned into a 4-hour discussion about everything that had gone wrong with the project and how it might be fixed. Daniel frowned. "I remember that day. You came home excited, talking about urban planning frameworks and community integration. I thought you were just being enthusiastic about your degree." "I was," I acknowledged. "But your father was actually listening to me, really listening, in a way no one in the industry had before. He called me the next day and asked if I would consult on the project, unofficially." "Why unofficially?" Daniel asked. Preston cleared his throat. "If I may add some context, at that time, Whitmore Development was in serious financial trouble. The company's public image was one of strength and stability, but behind the scenes, Gerald was fighting to keep the banks at bay." I nodded. "He couldn't afford to publicly bring in new consultants or make dramatic changes without alarming investors and creditors, so he asked me to work with him privately." "And you never thought to mention this to me?" Daniel's voice had an edge now. "I did at first," I reminded him. "I told you your father had asked for my input on some projects. You seemed pleased but uninterested in the details. Whenever I tried to talk about it, your eyes would glaze over." Recognition flickered across his face. I could see him remembering those early conversations, how he would nod politely before changing the subject to something he found more engaging. "It didn't seem important then," he admitted reluctantly. "Dad was always bringing in consultants. I didn't realize that I wasn't just another consultant," I finished for him. "Neither did I at first. I thought it was a short-term arrangement. But when the Westfield pivot succeeded, he asked me to look at other projects. One project became 2, then 3, then a complete portfolio review, all while maintaining your cover as just Daniel's wife," Preston added, unable to keep a note of admiration from his voice. "It wasn't a cover," I insisted firmly. I am Daniel's wife. That part was always real." "But you've been living a double life," Daniel said. "Coming home to me every night, pretending to be something you're not." That stung. I never pretended to be anything, Daniel. You and your family made assumptions about who I was, what I was, capable of. I simply stopped correcting you after the first few years. What's that supposed to mean? The defensive tone I knew so well had entered his voice. I tried to keep the frustration from my own. It means that when Victoria mocked my little job at the city planning department at our wedding reception, you laughed along with her. When Christopher joked that I should stick to planning dinner parties instead of offering business opinions, you said nothing. Daniel had the grace to look ashamed. They were just teasing. No, they weren't, I said quietly. They were establishing boundaries, making it clear that I wasn't to step outside the role they had assigned me. And you enforced those boundaries by never challenging them. Preston nodded slightly. Gerald noticed this dynamic as well. He mentioned it to me several times over the years. So you both just decided to deceive everyone? Daniel's expression hardened again. You and my father creating this shadow arrangement where you secretly ran the company while the rest of us were kept in the dark? I felt a flash of genuine anger. What exactly were we supposed to do, Daniel? Your father recognized my abilities and wanted to utilize them. I had ideas that could save the company, his legacy, your inheritance. Should we have waited for your siblings' approval? For them to suddenly overcome their prejudice and acknowledge that the middle school teacher's daughter might actually understand business? Daniel fell silent, unable to argue the point. Gerald and I tried to bring you all into the fold, gradually. I continued more gently. Remember when he suggested you join the strategic planning committee? Or when he nominated you for the board position? I declined, Daniel said flatly. Those meetings were boring. They were the actual governance of the company, I corrected him. Your father was trying to involve you in the real work, to prepare you for a meaningful role. But you preferred the title without the responsibility. The truth of my words seemed to hit Daniel like a physical blow. For perhaps the first time, he was confronting his own role in how events had unfolded. So what happens now? He finally asked, looking between Preston and me. You own everything, and I just… What? Work for my wife? Preston intervened. Actually, Daniel, if you'd allow me to explain, Gerald's plan wasn't to disinherit you or your siblings. It was to align authority with competence. I nodded, grateful for Preston's calm interjection. Your father wanted all of you to have meaningful roles in the company, roles suited to your actual skills and interests, not just your last name. What does that mean in practice? Daniel asked warily. It means, I explained, that you won't be forced to pretend interest in financial reports or strategic planning anymore. You've always been good with people, Daniel. You're naturally charismatic. You remember names and details about clients' families. You build trust easily. His expression softened slightly, surprised by the genuine compliment. Gerald and I discussed creating a new position for you, Chief of Client Relations. You would be the public face of Whitmore Development for our most important relationships, handling the social aspects that neither your father nor I ever excelled at. A figurehead position, Daniel said bitterly. No, I insisted. A vital role that leverages your actual strengths instead of forcing you into a role that never suited you. When was the last time you truly enjoyed your work, Daniel? When you weren't anxious about quarterly reviews or board presentations? He didn't answer, but I could see the consideration in his eyes. And what about Victoria and Christopher? He asked after a moment. Similar arrangements, Preston replied. Positions aligned with their actual abilities, not their expectations, or ego. They'll never accept it, Daniel said with certainty. Perhaps not initially, I acknowledged, but they have time to consider their options carefully. As Preston explained, the alternative isn't particularly attractive. Daniel stood suddenly and walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline. 15 years, he said, almost to himself. My wife and my father running the company together while I, played at being an executive? I joined him by the window, careful to maintain a respectful distance. That's not fair to yourself, Daniel. You did the job you were given. You managed your division effectively. You weren't playing. You just weren't involved in the larger strategic decisions. Because I wasn't interested, he said with sudden self-awareness. Because it was easier to let Dad handle all that and just coast. Preston had discreetly moved to the far side of the room, giving us as much privacy as possible while remaining present as requested. I need to know, Daniel said, turning to face me directly. All these years, living this double life, were you ever going to tell me the truth if Dad hadn't died? The question hung between us, weighted with 15 years of unspoken truths. Yes, I said finally. Gerald and I had discussed it many times. The 3-year mark of the corporate restructuring seemed like the right moment, this coming April. We were going to call a family meeting and explain everything together. But then he got sick, Daniel concluded. I nodded. And everything changed. His decline was so rapid that we had to accelerate the planning. That's when he revised his will and recorded all the video documentation. Daniel's gaze was still searching, still uncertain. And us? Our marriage? Where does that fit into all this? It was the question I had been dreading since the moment Preston had begun reading the will. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wasn't sure Daniel was ready to hear it. Our marriage is separate from Whitmore development, I said carefully. It always has been for me. But I won't pretend these revelations won't affect us, Daniel. You just learned that your wife has been working closely with your father for our entire marriage, making decisions that affected your family's company, all without your knowledge. That's an understatement, he said with a humorless laugh. The question now, I continued, is whether you can forgive what you see as deception, and whether I can forgive what I experienced as dismissal and condescension over the years. Daniel looked genuinely startled. You need to forgive me? Yes, I said simply, for never seeing me clearly, for accepting your siblings' evaluation of my worth without question, for being content to let me remain in the background of your life, defined solely by my relationship to you rather than by my own abilities and contributions. The truth landed heavily between us. For several long moments, Daniel said nothing, absorbing the full implications of my words. Finally, he turned back to Preston. I'd like to see those videos, the ones of Dad explaining his decisions. Preston nodded. Of course. I can arrange a private viewing whenever you're ready. And I want to review the corporate restructuring documents, Daniel added, surprising me. I want to understand exactly what happened 3 years ago. That can also be arranged, Preston confirmed. Daniel turned back to me, his expression unreadable. I need time to process all of this. I understand, I said quietly. Take all the time you need. He nodded once, formally, as if we were concluding a business meeting rather than a conversation that might determine the future of our marriage. I'll be at the lake house, he said, already moving toward the door. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk. As Daniel left the room, Preston and I exchanged glances. The first revelation was complete, but the real aftermath was just beginning. The Whitmore Development Corporation headquarters occupied the top 8 floors of a sleek glass tower in the heart of downtown. The building itself, one of Gerald's signature projects, had won multiple awards for its sustainable design and energy efficiency. It was one of the first projects I had substantially influenced, though the industry still credited the innovations to Gerald's visionary leadership. The morning after the will reading, I stood in the private elevator that would take me directly to the executive floor. For 15 years, I had used the main elevators, blending in with other employees, playing the role of Daniel's wife, visiting her husband, or attending a company event. Today would be different. Preston had suggested waiting a few days before, making my first appearance as the acknowledged CEO, but I knew better. In the corporate world, as in nature, a power vacuum, even briefly, could be deadly. Victoria and Christopher would already be mobilizing, reaching out to allies, spreading their version of events. I needed to establish control immediately. The elevator doors opened directly into the executive reception area. Marianne, who had been Gerald's executive assistant for 20 years, stood waiting with a warm smile. "Good morning, Ms. Reynolds," she said, emphasizing my name with satisfaction. Marianne had been one of the few people aware of my actual role in the company. "The executive team is assembled in the conference room as requested. Mr. Christopher and Ms. Victoria arrived 15 minutes ago and are waiting in Mr. your office." I raised an eyebrow. Did they now? And how did they gain access? Marianne's smile turned apologetic. Mr. Christopher still had his emergency key card. Security has been notified to deactivate it, but he was already in the building. I see. And who else is here this early? Mr. Robert Phillips arrived from the West Coast Division last night. Ms. Anita Devereaux from Legal is here. Mr. James Wong from Finance. All the department heads you requested. I nodded, mentally preparing for what would undoubtedly be the first of many confrontations. Please tell the executive team I'll join them shortly. First, I need to address the situation in my office. The corner office that had been Gerald's, and was now mine, featured floor-to-ceiling windows with panoramic views of the city. I paused outside the frosted glass doors, hearing the murmur of voices within. Then I straightened my shoulders, keyed in my access code, and entered. Victoria and Christopher were making themselves comfortable. Victoria perched on the edge of Gerald's antique desk, Christopher pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter. That had been our gift to Gerald on his 70th birthday. They both froze as I entered, their expressions shifting from surprised to hostile in an instant. "Good morning," I said calmly, setting my briefcase on a side table. "I don't recall scheduling a meeting with either of you this early." Christopher swirled the amber liquid in his glass, a deliberate mirror of his father's habit. "We don't need an appointment to access our father's office." "Former office," I corrected him. "And actually, you do need an appointment, or at least permission." Victoria slid off the desk, her Louboutins clicking against the hardwood floor as she approached me. "Cut the power play, Elena. We all know what happened here." "Do we?" I kept my voice neutral. "Please enlighten me." "You manipulated our father," Christopher said, setting down his glass with deliberate force. "You worked your way into his confidence and took advantage of his declining health to position yourself as his successor." I smiled slightly. "That's certainly one interpretation. Incorrect, but creative." "We've been talking to people," Victoria said, folding her arms across her designer blazer. "Key investors, board members, senior management. No one seems particularly comfortable with a glorified assistant suddenly taking control of a multi-billion-dollar company. This was the approach I had expected, undermining my legitimacy, trying to create uncertainty about the transition. Fortunately, Gerald and I had anticipated this exact strategy. "How interesting," I replied, moving to sit behind the desk that was now mine. "Because I've also been speaking with the board, our investors, and the executive team, not just since yesterday, but for the past 3 years as CEO of GW Innovations. They seem quite comfortable with the arrangement. Titles on paper," Christopher dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Ask anyone who actually runs this company who they report to, who approves their budgets, who signs off on major decisions. It's always been Dad." "Was always Gerald," I corrected, "with my input and direction for the past 15 years, and for the past 3 years, with my signature on the actual documents, which Gerald merely presented as his own to maintain the illusion you both so desperately needed." Victoria's perfectly composed face showed the first crack of uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" I opened my laptop and turned it toward them, displaying a document database. "These are all the major decisions made in the past 3 years. Design approvals, land acquisitions, hiring and firing of senior personnel, compensation packages, everything that you believed your father was handling personally. I clicked on a random file, displaying a major acquisition approval from the previous year. Gerald's signature was visible at the bottom, but above it was another signature, mine, with the notation, primary approval. "This is meaningless," Christopher insisted, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Anyone can create backdated documents." "You're right," I agreed, closing the laptop. "Which is why Gerald insisted on video documentation of our working, relationship and decision-making process. Every Monday for the past 5 years, our strategic planning sessions were recorded. Every quarterly review, every major decision point, all preserved with timestamps and authentication protocols." Victoria and Christopher exchanged glances, their confidence visibly wavering. "There's a board meeting this afternoon," I continued, checking my watch. "I assume you're both planning to attend and raise objections to my leadership." "That is, of course, your right as minority shareholders." "You're damn right we will," Christopher confirmed. "Excellent. Then perhaps we can conclude this impromptu meeting? I have an executive team waiting, and you both presumably need time to prepare your arguments." Neither moved. Victoria's eyes narrowed calculatingly. "What's your endgame here, Elena? What do you actually want?" The question caught me slightly off guard. After years of careful planning, focusing on the mechanics of the transition, I hadn't expected such a direct inquiry about my motivations. "What do I want?" I repeated, considering. "I want what Gerald wanted, for Whitmore Development to continue its evolution into an industry leader in sustainable building practices. I want the company he built to thrive under leadership that understands its potential and its responsibilities." "Cut the corporate speak," Christopher interrupted. "What do you want from us?" I met his gaze directly. "I want you to earn your positions. For once. To contribute based on actual merit rather than entitlement. Gerald believed you both had valuable skills that were being wasted because you were too busy playing at being executives to do meaningful work." Victoria laughed harshly. "So we should just happily accept demotions and work for our brother's wife? Is that the grand plan?" "Your father's plan," I corrected her, "was for each of you to find roles that aligned with your actual strengths. Victoria, your talent for public relations and your social connections could be invaluable if directed properly. Christopher, your ability to charm clients and close deals is genuinely impressive when you actually focus on the work." Their expressions showed surprise. They hadn't expected acknowledgement of their strengths from me. "But neither of you has the patience for operational details or the vision for long-term strategy that this company needs at the top," I continued. "Gerald recognized that 15 years ago, which is why he sought my help in the first place." Christopher's face darkened again. "So, we're supposed to just accept your evaluation of our abilities and fall in line?" "No," I said simply. "You're supposed to prove me wrong. Show up at the board meeting this afternoon with substantive objections based on business concerns, not wounded pride. Demonstrate that you understand the company's operations well enough to challenge my leadership on legitimate grounds." I stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Or you can continue with emotional appeals and vague accusations of manipulation, which the board has already been well prepared to dismiss." "Your choice." Victoria's expression had become calculating again. "You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you? This whole innocent victim act, the quiet wife in the background, it was all calculated." "No, Victoria," I said tiredly. "The calculation was all on your side, deciding I wasn't worth taking seriously because of where I came from, who I married, what you assumed about my capabilities. I simply stopped wasting energy trying to change your mind and focused on doing the work instead." I moved toward the door, opening it in clear dismissal. "I'll see you both at the board meeting. 2 o'clock, main conference room." After a moment of tense silence, they moved toward the exit, Christopher pausing as he passed me. "This isn't over," he said quietly. not by a long shot. I know, I replied just as quietly. But ask yourself this, Christopher. In 15 years, have you ever actually won a battle against your father when he truly wanted something? Because everything that's happening now is exactly what Gerald wanted. The flash of uncertainty in his eyes told me the point had landed. As they left, Marianne appeared in the doorway. The executive team is still waiting, Ms. Reynolds, and security has deactivated all the old access credentials as requested. Thank you, Marianne. I'll head to the conference room now. I gathered my materials, mentally shifting gears from the confrontation to the crucial meeting ahead. The executive conference room fell silent as I entered. 12 people sat around the polished table, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned to openly supportive. These were the people who actually ran Whitmore Development's day-to-day operations. The senior executives who had worked with me behind the scenes for years, while Gerald had been the public face of leadership. Robert Phillips, who managed the West Coast operations that Christopher nominally directed, offered me a small nod of encouragement. Anita from legal straightened her papers, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes alert and supportive. James from finance didn't bother hiding his smile. He had been the one to implement many of my financial strategies over the years, watching as Victoria took credit for their success. Good morning, everyone, I began, taking my place at the head of the table. As you're all aware, significant changes are underway following Gerald's passing. I want to thank each of you for your discretion and support during the transition period. I paused, looking around the table. For those of you who have worked directly with me over the years, today simply formalizes what has been our working relationship already. For others, this may represent a more substantial adjustment. A hand raised tentatively from the middle of the table. Marcus Chen, head of the International Division, had always reported directly to Gerald. Ms. Reynolds, or should we call you Mrs. Whitmore now? Ms. Reynolds is fine, Marcus. Or Elena, as always. He nodded. The Asia-Pacific projects were directly overseen by Mr. Gerald. Will that arrangement continue under your leadership? It was a reasonable question, and I appreciated its focus on business rather than the family drama unfolding. I plan to maintain oversight of the Asia-Pacific portfolio for now, I confirmed. However, I'd like to schedule a detailed review with you later this week to discuss whether adjustments would be beneficial. The tension in the room noticeably decreased as the conversation shifted to concrete operational matters. One by one, the executives raised questions about reporting structures, ongoing projects, and strategic priorities, all the normal concerns during a leadership transition. None mentioned Victoria or Christopher directly, though I could see the unasked questions in some of their eyes. Finally, Anita from legal addressed the elephant in the room. Ms. Reynolds, the board meeting this afternoon is likely to be contentious. Would you like me to prepare any specific materials beyond what we've already assembled? I smiled slightly. Thank you, Anita, but I believe we're well prepared. Victoria and Christopher will undoubtedly challenge the transition, but they'll be doing so from an emotional rather than a substantive position. And Mr. Daniel? Robert asked carefully. Where does he stand in all this? A fair question, but a complicated one. Mr. Daniel is taking time to process these developments, I answered diplomatically. He was not aware of the full extent of my involvement with the company until yesterday. This produced a few raised eyebrows, but no one commented further. The meeting continued with discussions of immediate priorities and pending decisions that needed my attention. By the time we concluded, the initial awkwardness had largely dissipated, replaced by the familiar rhythm of business operations. As the team dispersed, Robert lingered behind. Rough morning? He asked quietly, nodding toward Gerald's, my office. As expected, I confirmed. Victoria and Christopher made an appearance to stake their claim and issue vague threats. He nodded thoughtfully. They've been calling key. People since last night. Trying to build a coalition. Any success? Limited, he said with a small smile. Most of the senior team has known the real situation for years. And those who didn't, well, no one wants to back the wrong horse, especially when the right one is clearly in the lead. I appreciated his candor. And what about you, Robert? You've worked more closely with Christopher than most. Any conflicted loyalties? He laughed outright at that. Elena, I've been implementing your strategies and fixing Christopher's mistakes for 5 years. I know exactly who built the West Coast Division's success, and it wasn't the man with his name on the door. His loyalty was reassuring but highlighted another challenge I would face. We need to be careful about that narrative, I cautioned. This transition works best if we focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on past arrangements. Robert nodded in understanding. Of course, though I can't help but look forward to this afternoon's board meeting. Victoria and Christopher have been dismissing other people's contributions for so long, they've forgotten how to build actual allies. As he left, I turned to the window, looking out at the city Gerald had helped shape, the city we had reshaped, together over the past 15 years. The first confrontation had gone largely as expected, but it was only the opening move in what would undoubtedly be a complex game. The board meeting was next, and with it, the first real test of whether Gerald's carefully constructed transition plan would hold. The main conference room of Whitmore Development Corporation was designed to impress. With its 20-foot ceilings, wall-to-wall windows overlooking the city skyline, and a massive table crafted from reclaimed redwood, it made a statement about the company's prosperity and commitment to sustainability. 2 priorities I had quietly championed for years. I arrived 30 minutes early for the board meeting, reviewing my materials one final time while Marianne arranged water and coffee for the attendees. The executive team's morning briefing had gone well, but the board presented a different challenge. While some members had worked closely with Gerald and were aware of my role, others had maintained more distant relationships with the company, and might be susceptible to Victoria and Christopher's narrative. The board members are beginning to arrive, Marianne informed me. Would you like me to show them in as they come or wait until everyone is here? Show them in as they arrive, I decided. I'd like a few minutes with each before the formal meeting begins. Philip Hargrove, the longest-serving board member and a contemporary of Gerald's, was the first to enter. His eyebrows rose slightly at finding me seated at the head of the table, Gerald's traditional position, but he recovered quickly. Ms. Reynolds, he greeted me, extending his hand. Or should I call you Ms. Whitmore now? Elena is fine, Philip, I said, shaking his hand firmly. Thank you for coming on short notice. He settled into a chair near mine, his expression thoughtful. I received quite an interesting call from Christopher last night. He had quite a lot to say about yesterday's will reading. I'm sure he did, I acknowledged. And what was your response? Philip's weathered face crinkled with amusement. I told him I'd speak with you directly before forming any opinions. Gerald and I were friends for 40 years. I know better than to underestimate his strategic thinking. I nodded appreciatively. Philip had always been perceptive. And now that you're speaking with me directly? He studied me for a moment. Gerald mentioned you often over the years, you know. Always in that careful way of his, where he'd highlight your contributions without explicitly stating your actual role. I started to piece it together maybe 5 years ago. This surprised me. You never said anything. It wasn't my place, he replied simply. Gerald was governing his company and his succession in his own way. But I will say this. I'm not surprised by his choice. Disappointed that he felt such elaborate deception was necessary, but not surprised by the outcome. His support was valuable, but I needed to be certain. Christopher and Victoria will challenge this transition today. They'll argue that Gerald was manipulated, that the corporate restructuring was fraudulent, that I lack the experience to lead. Philip's laugh was short and genuine. They can certainly try. But I was present for that restructuring, my dear. I signed off on the creation of GW Innovations and your appointment as its CEO. The papers may have been quietly processed, but they were entirely legitimate. The door opened again as more board members arrived. Over the next 20 minutes, I had brief conversations with each, gauging their positions and addressing concerns. Most were cautiously supportive, though two, longtime friends of the Whitmore family, were notably reserved, clearly waiting to hear all sides before committing to a position. At precisely 2 o'clock, Victoria and Christopher entered together, followed by their personal attorneys. Their coordinated entrance was clearly meant to project unity and determination. Victoria had changed into a more formal suit since our morning confrontation, while Christopher had added a pocket square in Whitmore Development's signature blue, a small but deliberate symbol of his claim to the family legacy. The energy in the room shifted immediately, conversations hushing as the siblings took seats directly across from me. Daniel was conspicuously absent, his empty chair a visible reminder of the family fracture in progress. "I believe we're all present," I said, glancing at Marianne, who nodded confirmation. "Let's begin." Anita Devereaux, our corporate counsel, opened with a formal acknowledgement of Gerald's passing and a summary of the succession plan that had been activated. Her presentation was clinical and precise, outlining the legal framework of the transition without emotion or embellishment. As of Gerald Whitmore's passing, she concluded, operational control of Whitmore Development Corporation and all subsidiary companies transferred to Elena Reynolds, who has served as CEO of GW Innovations, the controlling entity, since its formation 3 years ago. This board meeting has been called to address any questions or concerns about the transition and to ensure continuity of operations. Christopher was already shaking his head before she finished. "This is absurd," he interrupted. 3 days ago, none of us had ever heard of Elena having any official role in this company beyond being Daniel's wife. Now we're supposed to accept that she's been secretly running everything? Not secretly, Anita corrected. Discreetly. The corporate restructuring and leadership transition plan was approved by this very board 3 years ago. A restructuring, described to us as a tax optimization strategy, Victoria interjected, with no mention that it was actually transferring control to Elena. Philip Hargrove cleared his throat. "That's not entirely accurate, Victoria. The documentation clearly established GW Innovations as the controlling entity and named Elena as its chief executive. Those details were included in the materials distributed to all board members." Victoria's attorney leaned forward. Materials that buried these crucial details in hundreds of pages of technical language, while Mr. Whitmore verbally represented the change as merely structural. "That is a serious allegation," Anita replied coolly. "Are you suggesting that Gerald Whitmore deliberately misled the board?" The attorney backpedaled slightly. "We're suggesting that the full implications of the restructuring were not made explicitly clear to all parties." I decided it was time to intervene. The implications are actually quite straightforward. Gerald Whitmore, as the majority shareholder and founder of this company, determined that I was the most qualified person to succeed him as CEO. He implemented a transition plan that was legally sound and approved by this board. The only unusual aspect was his decision to delay the public announcement of that transition. "And why would he do that?" Christopher demanded. "Why the elaborate deception if everything was above board?" It was Philip who answered, his voice, gentle but firm. "Because he knew how you and Victoria would react, Christopher. He knew you would fight this transition every step of the way, regardless of whether it was in the best interest of the company." Victoria's perfectly controlled expression cracked slightly. "That's a convenient narrative. The simpler explanation is that Elena manipulated a man who was already contemplating his mortality, using her position as his daughter-in-law to gain his trust and undermine his children." I had anticipated this line of attack and was prepared. Anita, would you please distribute the documentation package? Anita passed thick folders to each board member. These materials include video transcripts and financial analyses demonstrating Ms. Reynolds's contributions to Whitmore development over the past 15 years, with particular emphasis on the last 5 years of strategic planning. Anyone can create documentation after the fact, Christopher's attorney objected. Which is why we've also included third-party verifications, Anita countered smoothly. Timestamps, electronic signatures, and witness statements from key executives who worked directly with Ms. Reynolds and Mr. Whitmore during this period. The board members began reviewing the materials, the room growing quiet except for the rustling of papers. I watched their expressions change as they absorbed the extent of my involvement in the company's major decisions, projects, and successes over the years. Victoria, ever the quicker strategist of the siblings, changed tactics. Even if we accept that Elena had some advisory role, which these materials suggest, that doesn't automatically qualify her to lead a company of this size and complexity. What are her actual credentials? Where is her business degree? Her industry experience outside of whatever guidance our father provided? It was a predictable pivot. When the facts couldn't be denied, attack qualifications instead. My credentials, I responded calmly, are in the financial statements in front of you. Under my strategic direction, working alongside Gerald, Whitmore Development's value has tripled in 15 years. We've expanded into 5 new markets, pioneered sustainable building practices that have become industry standards, and maintained profitability through 2 major market downturns. I turned to the financial summary page in their packets. You'll note that the most significant periods of growth align precisely with initiatives that I personally developed and implemented. The Westfield Pivot, the Riverfront District concept, the Pacific Shores development, the green building standards that now generate 30% of our consulting revenue. Christopher scoffed, but I noticed several board members nodding thoughtfully as they reviewed the data. Furthermore, I continued, Gerald didn't make this decision lightly or hastily. The materials before you document a deliberate evaluation process spanning 5 years. He considered multiple succession scenarios, including each of his children, individually and various executive combinations. I met Victoria's gaze directly. The data-driven conclusion, which Gerald ultimately accepted, was that none of his children had demonstrated the strategic vision or operational expertise necessary to lead the company he had built. This is outrageous, Christopher exploded, slapping his hand on the table. You're sitting there calmly telling us our father decided we weren't good enough to run our own family company? No, I corrected him. I'm telling you, Gerald recognized that each of you has different strengths, none of which align with the specific skills needed for the CEO position. That's not a personal failing. It's simply a matter of aptitude and interest. Victoria's attorney intervened before Christopher could escalate further. The board should be aware that my clients are considering legal action to contest the will and the corporate restructuring on several grounds, including undue influence and breach of fiduciary duty. Anita seemed almost bored by this threat. They're certainly entitled to pursue litigation. However, as outlined on page 47 of your materials, Gerald anticipated this response and implemented several protective measures. The board members turned to the referenced page as Anita continued. First, as you're aware, the will specifically penalizes any challenge by revoking the challenger's personal inheritance. Second, the corporate bylaws were amended 3 years ago to require a 70% shareholder vote for any leadership change, making it mathematically impossible for the siblings to force a change without Elena's support. She paused, letting that sink in. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, the company's major clients, lenders, and investors have all been briefed on the succession plan and have provided letters of support, which are included in Appendix C. This was news to Victoria and Christopher, whose expressions betrayed their shock. Gerald had been more thorough than even they had anticipated. When exactly did this briefing happen? Victoria demanded. Over the past 3 months, I answered. As Gerald's health declined, we accelerated the transition planning. The top 20 clients, representing 65% of our current projects, have been personally briefed about my role and the succession plan. Christopher looked genuinely betrayed. I met with Westland Properties just last month. They never mentioned any of this. Because they were asked to maintain confidentiality until after Gerald's passing, I explained. But they, like our other key partners, have been aware of my actual role for years. Who do you think they called when they had concerns about project timelines or budget issues? The momentum was shifting. I could see it in the body language of the board members, in the way Victoria and Christopher's attorneys were now leaning toward each other, whispering urgently. Philip Hargrove, sensing the change as well, moved to bring the discussion back to governance. I believe the documentation is quite clear about the legal standing of Ms. Reynolds as CEO. The question before this board is not whether to approve the transition, that was decided 3 years ago, but how to ensure it proceeds smoothly for the benefit of the company, its employees, and its shareholders. Victoria, ever strategic, recognized the shift and adjusted her approach again. If we set aside the question of how this situation developed, she said, her voice suddenly reasonable, we still need to address the practical implications. Elena has never held a public-facing leadership role. Our clients and partners expect to work with Whitmores. It's been that way for 3 generations. I had anticipated this concern as well, which is why Gerald and I developed a transition plan that includes continued involvement from the Whitmore family in client-facing roles. As I explained to Christopher and Victoria this morning, there are meaningful positions for each of them that leverage their actual strengths. Demotions, you mean, Christopher muttered. Realignments, I corrected. Christopher, your talent for client relations is genuinely valuable. Victoria, your social connections and public presence are assets to this company. Daniel's natural empathy and relationship-building skills are significant strengths. None of you needs to leave Whitmore Development. You simply need to contribute in ways that match your abilities rather than your expectations. The boardroom fell silent as the siblings absorbed this offer. It wasn't what they wanted, control of the company, but it represented a dignified compromise that would allow them to save face publicly while remaining connected to the family legacy. Victoria recovered first, her analytical mind clearly calculating the best strategy given the evidence before the board. We would need to review the specific terms of these realignments before considering any such arrangement. Of course, I agreed. Detailed role descriptions and compensation packages have been prepared for each of you, as Gerald directed. Anita can provide those materials whenever you're ready to discuss them constructively. Christopher still seemed resistant, but I could see the fight draining from him as the reality of the situation became clearer. With the board largely convinced by the documentation, their legal options limited by Gerald's careful planning, and their leverage diminishing by the minute, outright opposition was becoming less viable. Philip, sensing the shift toward resolution, moved to formalize the board's position. I propose we take a vote to officially acknowledge Elena Reynolds as Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Development Corporation, in accordance with the succession plan established by Gerald Whitmore and previously approved by this board. The vote was quick and decisive. 7 in favor, 2 abstentions, no opposition. Even the board members who had seemed hesitant earlier recognized the legal reality and the thoroughness of Gerald's planning. As the meeting concluded, Victoria approached me while Christopher hung back, still seething but noticeably deflated. "This isn't finished," she said quietly, her perfect composure back in place. "You may have won this round, but don't think for a moment that we're simply going to fall in line and accept subordinate positions in our own family company." I met her gaze steadily. "I never expected you would, Victoria. That would be entirely out of character for you. But consider this. Your father spent 5 years creating this transition plan, anticipating and addressing every objection and obstacle you might raise. Do you really believe you can unravel in a few weeks what he so carefully constructed?" Her expression remained stony, but I saw the calculation in her eyes. Victoria had always been the most pragmatic of the siblings. "We'll review the role descriptions," she said finally. "But don't expect gratitude or cooperation. This company should have stayed in the family." "It has," I replied simply, "just not in the way you expected." As Victoria and Christopher left with their attorneys, the remaining board members offered congratulations and support. Philip lingered behind, his expression thoughtful. "That went about as well as could be expected," he observed, "though I suspect the real challenges are just beginning." I nodded, gathering my materials. "Victoria won't give up easily. She'll look for weaknesses, for opportunities to undermine my authority or force errors. And Christopher will bluster and threaten, but ultimately follow his sister's lead," Philip agreed. "What about Daniel? His absence today was conspicuous." The question touched on the most painful aspect of this transition, the uncertain future of my marriage. "Daniel is taking time to process everything. He was as surprised as his siblings by the extent of my involvement with the company." Philip's expression softened with genuine concern. "Gerald put you in an impossible position, didn't he? Asking you to maintain this deception even from your husband." "It was my choice too," I admitted. "I could have insisted on transparency with Daniel years ago, but I adapted to the arrangement. It seemed simpler to keep those worlds separate. And now?" I sighed, feeling the emotional weight I'd been holding at bay during the confrontation. "Now we find out if our marriage can survive the truth." As I left the boardroom, my professional victory was tempered by personal uncertainty. The company was secure. Gerald's careful planning had ensured that. But the cost to my marriage, to the life I had built alongside my work with Gerald, remained to be seen. Daniel still hadn't called. 3 days after the board meeting, I found myself alone in the penthouse apartment Daniel and I had shared for the past 7 years. The space felt larger, emptier somehow, without his presence. Daniel had remained at the lake house, our occasional text exchanges brief and practical. He needed some documents from his home office. He'd arranged for his assistant to pick up more clothes. He was still processing. My phone buzzed with a message from Marianne. "Mr. Phillips has the quarterly projections ready for your review. Conference call in 15 minutes? I confirmed the call and moved to the home office, the visible one, not the hidden workspace where I had conducted my Whitmore development business for years. That secret office, concealed behind a bookshelf in my study, now stood open. There was no need for hidden spaces anymore. The transition at the company had been proceeding with surprising smoothness. After the initial shock, most employees had adapted quickly to the revealed reality. Many had suspected something similar for years, observing how Gerald would defer to my input in meetings or quote my analyses without attribution. A few had even privately expressed relief that the shadow structure was finally acknowledged. Victoria and Christopher had retreated to strategic silence, neither accepting nor explicitly rejecting the role proposals I had presented. Their absence from the office was conspicuous, but not disruptive. The departments they nominally headed had been effectively run by others for years. Only the emptiness in my personal life remained unresolved. I picked up a framed photo from the desk, Daniel and me on our 10th anniversary trip to Greece. We were smiling, his arm around my shoulders, the Mediterranean sparkling behind us. Had it all been real, that happiness? Or had the deception I maintained poisoned even our genuine moments? The intercom buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. "Ms. Reynolds," the building's security guard announced. "Mr. Daniel Whitmore is here to see you." My heart stuttered. "Send him up, please." I moved to the living room, suddenly acutely aware of how I looked after 3 days of minimal sleep and maximum stress. I'd changed out of my work clothes into comfortable loungewear, not the carefully curated casual elegance I typically maintained around the Whitmore family, but the simple comfort I actually preferred. The elevator opened directly into our penthouse, and Daniel stepped out, looking similarly exhausted. He carried a small overnight bag, though whether it signaled a return or just a brief visit remained unclear. "Daniel," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I didn't expect you." "Clearly," he replied, glancing at my casual attire. But there was no judgment in his tone, just observation. An awkward silence stretched between us. 3 days apart after 15 years of marriage had created a strange formality. "Would you like some coffee?" I offered, falling back on social niceties. "I've seen the videos," he said instead of answering. "The recordings of you and Dad working together. Uncle Preston showed me." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. 15 years. He shook his head slightly. "All those nights you were working late at the city planning department. All those weekends you spent organizing community projects. You were actually running the company with him." "Not at first," I clarified. "In the beginning, it really was just consultation on specific projects. But gradually, yes, it evolved into a partnership." Daniel moved further into the living room but didn't sit. "I watched a strategy session from last year. You and Dad discussing the Burton acquisition, the one Christopher thought was his idea." I remembered that session clearly. Christopher had mentioned the Burton property casually during a family dinner, having heard about it from a golfing buddy. Gerald had nodded politely, already knowing that I had been analyzing the acquisition potential for weeks and had a complete proposal ready. "You finished each other's sentences," Daniel continued. "You had this shorthand, like you'd been having the same conversation for years, which I guess you had been. We worked well together," I acknowledged. "Your father had the industry experience and instincts. I brought analytical skills and fresh perspectives." Daniel finally sat on the edge of the sofa. "He respected you. I could see it in the videos. Not just listened to you or tolerated you, actually respected your mind? Yes. There was no point denying it. And I respected him. Despite the deception, despite the complicated arrangement, I learned so much from him. Daniel trailed off, staring at his hands. While I was what? The oblivious husband? The useless son who couldn't be trusted with the truth? The pain in his voice was palpable. And for the first time, I fully confronted what our arrangement had cost him. Not just in terms of company control or inheritance, but in dignity and self-worth. "You were the man I fell in love with," I said quietly. "The man who saw me as more than my background or education when we first met. Who defended me to your mother when she questioned whether I was suitable for a Whitmore." His expression softened slightly at the memory. "Mom was horrible to you in those early days." "Yes, she was," I agreed. "And you stood up to her. That meant everything to me." "But it wasn't enough," he concluded, his voice hollow. "Supporting you socially wasn't the same as supporting your ambitions." I moved to sit across from him, close, but not touching. "Daniel, your father and I made choices that prioritized the company's success over complete honesty with you and your siblings. Those choices had consequences, some positive, some deeply painful. But they weren't a reflection of your worth. Weren't they? Dad clearly didn't think I could handle the truth, or contribute meaningfully to the company's future. This was the heart of the matter, Daniel's wounded pride, his sense of inadequacy revealed by his father's choices. Gerald had very specific ideas about leadership, I explained carefully. He measured everyone against his own capabilities and found most people wanting, including his children. That says more about his expectations than your abilities. Daniel was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "The role you proposed for me, client relations, is that just a consolation prize? A way to keep me occupied while you run everything?" No, I said firmly. It's a recognition of what you're actually good at. Daniel, you connect with people in ways your father never could. Clients trust you, open up to you. That's a genuine talent, and one the company needs. But not enough to lead, he observed. Leadership takes many forms, I countered. The company doesn't just need a strategic visionary. It needs someone who can maintain relationships, build trust, represent our values to clients and partners. That role isn't secondary. It's essential. He seemed to consider this, though. Doubt still shadowed his expression. And us? Our marriage? Where does that fit now that everything's out in the open? Now that you don't need to maintain the charade of the dutiful wife? The question stung. Is that what you think our marriage was? A charade? I don't know what to think anymore, he admitted. 15 years, Elena. 15 years of you keeping this massive part of your life separate from me. How do we come back? From that? It was the question I had been asking myself since the will reading. How do you rebuild trust after such a prolonged deception, even one with understandable motivations? I don't have a perfect answer, I said honestly. But I can tell you this. My feelings for you were never part of the deception. I compartmentalized my work with your father because it seemed simpler than forcing you to keep secrets from your siblings, than making you complicit in an arrangement you might not have approved. You didn't give me the choice, he pointed out. No, I acknowledged. I didn't, and that was wrong. My admission hung in the air between us. After so many justifications and explanations, the simple acknowledgement of wrong seemed to reach him, in a way nothing else had. I watched more than just the business videos, Daniel said after a moment. Preston had footage from family events too, Christmas dinners, summer barbecues. Dad apparently had security cameras everywhere. I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. There's this moment from last year's 4th of July, he continued. Everyone's on the patio at the lake house. Victoria's complaining about some zoning issue delaying her home renovation. Dad catches your eye across the table, this tiny glance, and you give him this almost imperceptible nod. I remembered the moment. The zoning issue had actually been a legitimate environmental concern that I had flagged weeks earlier. Later that evening, Daniel said, Dad announces he'll make a call to help with Victoria's problem. She's thrilled, thanks him profusely. And you're just quietly sipping your wine, not taking any credit. That was our arrangement, I explained. Gerald was the public face. I was the behind-the-scenes advisor. But why? Daniel pressed. Why were you content to let him take credit for your work for 15 years? That's not the ambitious woman I married. It was a perceptive question, one that forced me to articulate something I had never fully examined. Because the work itself mattered more to me than the recognition, I realized as I spoke. Seeing my ideas implemented, my strategies succeed. That was satisfying even without public acknowledgement. And now that you have both the work and the recognition, I considered the question carefully. It's different. There's a freedom in not having to filter everything through Gerald, in being able to directly implement changes I believe in. But there's also greater scrutiny, greater pressure. Daniel nodded slowly. I've been thinking a lot about that moment, you quietly letting Dad take credit while remaining in the background. And I realized something. What's that? I asked. I did the same thing to you, he said, his voice catching slightly. All those times you tried to talk about your ideas, your work. I dismissed them, changed the subject, made it clear I wasn't interested. I pushed you into that same background role in our marriage. His self-awareness surprised me. Daniel, no, let me finish, he insisted. I've had 3 days to think about this, 3 days to review our entire marriage through this new lens, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. I failed you as much as you deceived me. The admission hung in the air between us, a shared culpability that somehow felt like the first honest exchange we'd had in years. So, where does that leave us? I finally asked. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know exactly, but I do know I'm not ready to give up on 15 years of marriage because my father and wife outmaneuvered me in business. Despite everything, a small smile tugged at my lips. That's a very pragmatic view. I am a Whitmore, he replied, with the first hint of humor I'd seen from him since the will reading. Pragmatism is in our DNA. Along with stubbornness and an excessive fondness for Scotch, I added. He actually chuckled at that, the tension between us easing slightly. True on both counts. We lapsed into a more comfortable silence, the rawness of confrontation giving way to tentative reconciliation. I'm not moving back in yet, Daniel finally said. I still need space, time to adjust to all of this. I understand, I said, and genuinely meant it. 15 years of deception couldn't be resolved in a single conversation. But I am willing to try the client relations position, he continued, not as a consolation prize or to save face, but because I think I might actually be good at it. The admission seemed to cost him some effort, acknowledging a place for himself in the company that didn't match his previous expectations. You would be, I confirmed. You've always had a gift for making people feel heard and valued. It's one of the things I love about you. Daniel looked surprised by the present tense. Love, not loved. Even after all this? Yes, I said simply. My feelings for you weren't part of the deception, Daniel. They were sometimes the reason for it. I didn't want to force you to keep secrets from your siblings, to create that conflict. He nodded slowly. I appreciate that, even if I disagree with the decision. He stood, picking up his overnight bag. I should go. I told Preston I'd meet him for dinner to discuss the legal aspects of all this. You're talking to Preston about the will? I asked, surprised. Not to challenge it, Daniel clarified. To understand it better, to make sure I'm making informed decisions about my role in the company going forward. His mature approach impressed me. It was a side of Daniel I had glimpsed occasionally but had never seen fully expressed. That seems wise, I acknowledged. At the elevator, he turned back. Elena? For what it's worth, I think Dad made the right choice. For the company, I mean. You were always the smartest person in any room. He recognized that even when the rest of us didn't. The compliment was unexpected and touching. Thank you, Daniel. I'm still mad as hell about how it all happened, he added with a wry smile. But I'm trying to separate my pride from my judgment. As the elevator doors closed behind him, I felt a cautious optimism. Daniel hadn't fully forgiven the deception, but he was processing it with more maturity than I had anticipated. Our marriage wasn't restored, but neither was it over. My phone buzzed with a message from Robert Phillips, the quarterly projections call I had completely forgotten. The conversation with Daniel had eclipsed everything else. As I moved back to my office to take the call, I realized I was navigating a new reality where my personal and professional lives were no longer compartmentalized. The integration would be challenging, messy, and at times painful, but also potentially more authentic than I had allowed myself to be in 15 years. The company was secure. My marriage was uncertain but not lost. Victoria and Christopher remained hostile but contained. After 15 years of careful planning and controlled narratives, I was finally stepping into the full truth of who I was and what I had built. For the first time since Gerald's death, I felt not just the weight of responsibility, but also the freedom of authenticity. 6 months after Gerald's will reading, I stood at the podium accepting the Urban Development Association's Lifetime Achievement Award posthumously awarded to my father-in-law. The Whitmore family sat in the front row, together in public for the first time since the funeral. Daniel, now thriving as chief of client relations, watched with quiet pride. Our marriage had slowly rebuilt itself, not returning to what it was, but evolving into something more honest and equal. Victoria sat beside him, her expression carefully neutral. After weeks of resistance, she'd accepted the position of chief, brand officer, a role utilizing her social connections while keeping her away from operational decisions. Our relationship remained professional, a détente born of pragmatism rather than warmth. Christopher, following an abandoned legal challenge, had finally settled into his role as Director of Business Development. He still avoided private meetings with me but had grudgingly begun acknowledging my authority. Today marks not just recognition of Gerald Whitmore's legacy, I concluded my speech, but the beginning of a new chapter for the company he built. A chapter where recognition is given where it's due, where talent is valued regardless of background, and where family is defined not just by blood, but by shared vision and mutual respect. As applause filled the room, I caught Preston's knowing smile from the second row. The attorney who had set everything in motion with that simple invitation. "Would you please join us? There's a matter concerning you in the will, after all." I'd entered that room as an outsider, dismissed and underestimated. I left it as the rightful heir to everything Gerald had built, not because I married into the family, but because I had earned it, one unrecognized contribution at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.